Welcome to Theology for the People. My name is Nick Cady, and on this episode, I'm joined by Brett McCracken. Brett is an author, a cultural commentator, and he's a senior editor for the Gospel Coalition. And in this episode, we speak about his recent book that came out. It's an edited volume called Scrolling Ourselves to Death, and it was inspired by Neil Postman's famous work, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which came out many years ago. But this book revisits some of those same ideas for a new era, but also looks at it through a spiritual lens. So it explores the spiritual consequences of our digital age and also how the church can respond with wisdom, intentionality, and hope. We talk about everything from plausibility structures to embodied discipleship to how smartphones shape not just our habits, but even our very ability to perceive the truth and to experience God. It's a fascinating conversation. I hope you'll enjoy it, and I'll be back at the end with some closing words. Brett, thanks for being a guest on Theology for the People.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Nick.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey and life and ministry, and what got you to this point where you're at today.
Yeah, I'm Midwestern, born and raised, grew up Baptist, Southern Baptist, Kansas City roots. But now I've been in California for almost 2 decades, I think. I came out here after I went to undergrad at Wheaton College in the Chicago area, and then came out to do graduate school at UCLA. And that was kind of my first venture to the West Coast. And I've been out here ever since. I worked at Biola University for about 9 years, and then have been working for the Gospel Coalition for the last 8 years as a full-time editor. So if you're familiar with the Gospel Coalition, we were founded by Don Carson and Tim Keller about 20 years ago. And we have a website that's basically like a resource for pastors, church leaders globally. I'm the arts and culture editor for our website. So anything we do in the areas of movies, music, worship music, cultural trends, technology falls to me in terms of like articles and things like that. So it's a great job. I love it. And then so a side thing in my story has been writing my own books. So apart from my day job at the Gospel Coalition, I'm an author. Have written 4 solo authored books and then a couple books of contributors. So this one that we're going to talk about, Scrolling Ourselves to Death, is edited by me, but I'm not the only author. There's a bunch of other great contributors to that book. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I have a wonderful family here. We live in Southern California, Orange County. I have a wife, Kira, and 3 kids, 6, 4, and 2 years old. So life is very full on the home front, as you can imagine. And we're part of a church called Southlands Santa Ana. It's a neighborhood church plant. We're about 5 years old. So we're small little church, literally in my neighborhood. We walk 2 blocks down the street to go to church and on Sundays, which is fun. And I have been an elder there, but have stepped off of eldership for the time being. But we're very involved with the church. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about what was the impetus for this book called Scrolling Ourselves to Death?
So there's a book that came out 40 years ago called Amusing Ourselves to Death by a guy named Neil Postman. And we at the Gospel Coalition, we were just talking a couple of years ago about hey, the 40th anniversary of Postman's kind of seminal work, and in many ways a prophetic book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. We knew that the 40th anniversary was going to be coming up in 2025, and we just thought, should we have an article about that? And then someone suggested, what if we did a whole book where we basically drew from Postman's insights 40 years ago about how technology back then was changing culture and how we can be alert to some of the more negative, problematic changes that technology was bringing. What if we applied some of his ideas to today's technological environment? And as we know, technological change has been accelerating rapidly. We live in a vastly different world technologically today than we did 20 years ago, let alone 40 years ago. So Neil Postman wrote his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in the pre-internet era. He wasn't even talking about like scrolling technologies and smartphones. He was mainly talking about like TV as a technology. And so, but a lot of what he was saying really rings true, but in an even more urgent way in the scrolling era. So we wanted to put together a book that basically brought together some of the best thinkers right now in like the Christianity and culture, Christianity and technology space, and have each of them contribute a chapter in an area of their expertise, broadly connected to this idea of how, as Christians, can we live wisely in a digital age? How can churches respond to all these technological changes? How can we disciple people to be healthy in a world where a lot of people are being formed, being shaped negatively by virtue of what they do on their smartphones and what's coming across their feeds? So that's kind of the idea behind the book.
Yeah. So, I mean, when Neil Postman wrote his book, I mean, it was mostly what TV, movies, going to the mall. Like, I think now everybody looks back at that time as like with so much nostalgia, as like
Right.
that we've lost something of
The
like
simpler times.
embodied humanness. And even in his time, he was like, we've already lost something from the era before. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, you draw a lot of insights. I mean, what were there some insights that he made? You said they were prophetic. Like, what are some of the things that he said? And is it worth reading his book now, or is it better to just, move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still worth reading. It's so much of that book holds up, 40 years later. There's parts of it that feel a little dated. Like I mentioned, he's really focusing on television, and like he's writing that book in the 80s when like Ronald Reagan was president, and he makes a big deal about like how crazy that is that a television actor, a Hollywood star like Ronald Reagan could become president. And,
Wow. Yeah, if he only knew.
if he only knew, right?
Yeah.
In today's world. So some of what he's writing feels a little bit quaint and outdated, but so much of it is very relevant. So for example, one of the things that he talks about a lot in Amusing Ourselves to Death is the way that television is just this kind of endless stream of like disconnected information. So like the evening news is like, he has this phrase, now ... this. Like now here's a story about a terrifying mass murder. Now here's the weather report. Now here's a story about genocide in Africa. Now here's a cute, feel good story about some cat, that was recovered. So it's just this, he was getting at the point that like discourse is trivialized in this world of like everything is reduced to, it's packaged as entertainment. That's so news about like substantial, important things was being consumed in the same way that like commercials for toothpaste were being consumed and like soap operas on TV were being consumed. It was all kind of flattened in this mediated experience. And I think that point, he was making that point about television. Obviously, that point is now like experienced on our feeds to like the nth degree, right? Like to the extreme, because all day, every day, what we're doing is we're scrolling through these social media feeds, and it's totally this like disconnected array of like now this, click on this, video that is catching your attention. Click on this headline about some horrifying news story that, is doom scrolling. Here's a little bit of this. The algorithm wants to feed you. Here's a little bit of this. And the effect is we're scrolling ourselves into oblivion, and we're becoming addicts of disconnected information, similar to what he was saying was happening in the television era, where we were becoming like hooked on this constant feed of amusement. And it was distracting us from actual action, actual involvement in real life. And how much more so is that the case in today's digital world, where so many of us are like hooked into this IV drip of digital stimulation, whether it's Netflix or Twitter or Instagram, TikTok, but like it's distracting us from the real work we can do in our tangible neighborhoods and cities and churches and nuclear families. And that's a big thing we talk about in Scrolling Ourselves to Death that is pertinent to Christian life and ministry life as the church. What do we do when the majority of people today, including people in our congregations and churches, are more compelled by and more aware of what's happening in the virtual space of the internet? News stories from far away, national headlines, international headlines, but they're fairly ignorant about what's happening locally because they're spending all their time in this like digital space rather than the actual space where God has placed them on this, earth. So I can talk more about that, but
Sure.
I mean, there's just so much there that I think we've lost in the digital world in terms of embodied life is like what we were created for. God did not create humans to just be brains on sticks where we're just information processors who can experience the world and interact with the world virtually. He created us with hands and feet and bodies to like get our hands dirty in the trenches of real life wherever we are. And I just think there's so many ministry implications for a world where people are spending more time and they're more compelled by the virtual than they are by the embodied and the tangible.
Yeah, it is a weird time that we live in. Like, as you're talking about like TV and his whole thing about like people gathering around the TV. Like now I have teenagers and it almost feels like a win if I can get them to sit around the TV. Like the TV feels like almost like
Right.
this weird old technology that we gather around for like family time to like share an experience together. And
Yeah,
you have
because
to
at
like,
least the TV is a more communal form of technology where you typically would sit around watching it with someone else. And for a generation of young people today, they're used to like personal device experiences of entertainment where the communal dynamic of media has been totally lost.
mm. Yeah, and then on the other hand, there's this whole thing where I notice, like, even amongst my kids, there's this, it almost feels rebellious to do things that are embodied. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're gonna like have this thing that we do where we do something like physical and embodied, right? Like, there's a resurgence in tactile
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
fountain pens and paper.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like those same people
Mm.
have other aspects of their life where they, they'll lose 2 hours down a TikTok rabbit hole
Yeah.
at the same time. And I was just
Yeah.
thinking about something else. It's not just young people, right? Like I don't
Right.
want to
No, not at
like
all.
I remember, my own parents who are in their 60s, like I remember them coming to our house and just sitting on the couch and just scrolling for like an
Yes,
hour,
for sure.
and
For
and
sure.
even my own kids are like, "Grandma, get off the phone,"
Hmm.
and it's
Right.
like,
Right.
and then the other day I went to the gym, which is of course like something you can't do digitally, although I'm
Hmm.
sure someone will try, but like
Hmm.
went to the gym and I ran into this guy who used to go to our church and
Hmm.
I'm like, "Hey bro, how you doing?" And this man's in his 60s and he's like, "Yeah, I've just been going to this online church from this guy." And he's like,
Hmm.
"Have you heard of him?" I'm like,
Hmm.
"No." And I'm like, "He's in Texas." And it's like,
Yeah.
and so that's a whole nother aspect to
It's
this.
a whole nother aspect. I think that aspect is under discussed because so much of the discourse around like the societal ills of social media and smartphones is about young people and Gen Z. But you're totally right that like there's this pressure, I think older people, baby boomers, let's say, feel to kind of learn technology and learn how to navigate a smartphone and be on an iPad and do social media. And it feels like, for them, it feels like if I'm going to be relevant and if I'm going to like navigate this world, I need to learn how to do this, which to some extent is true. But I feel like some of the most addicted people in today's world are older folks who just spend all day, every day scrolling. And they're also, I think, most susceptible to the kind of misinformation and AI deep fakes and
Mm,
like conspiracy theories and all that. All of us have gotten like some sort of crazy conspiracy theory email from some aunt, who's
right.
older.
Yeah.
So that's a dynamic that I feel like the church, Christians need to think about. Like, how do we disciple older people to feel like they're not going to be duped by using technology in the wrong way, how they're not going to become addicted, because it isn't just a young person problem.
I know, like with amongst our young adults and like younger families in our church, like people in their 20s and 30s, I see a big movement, especially among young men, to like ditch
Yes.
the smartphone,
Yes, for
get a
sure.
dumb phone.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like how do we like what kind of
Mm,
conclusions do
mm,
you find in this book that can
mhm,
help people like us who want to follow Jesus
mhm.
and yeah, what would you say?
I'm seeing that exact same thing. And it's very encouraging to me that it does seem like younger people are sensing that their lives have not been improved by these technologies and being on screens and scrolling through smartphones, social media, and maybe particularly for young men, it's also the problem of like pornography and how easy and ubiquitous that is in the smartphone age. And so
Hmm.
for them, especially, that choice to kind of go analog and to live life a little bit less dependent on screens is tied in with that very present uh, challenge. So yeah, I think a lot of what we're saying in the book, calling people to a more embodied life in terms of like, don't just go through your life as digital spectators, like be active participants. Put down your phone and go live life and pick up, your tools that you can be used by God to like do something in this world that's tangible. Like I think there's something inspiring to that call, and maybe young people, young men are really galvanized by that. Like they're like nodding along, like, yeah, like it is kind of a passive existence to just like spend all of my life scrolling through my phone, looking at other people's lives, looking at
Hmm.
influencers, for example, and being jealous and envious of influencers. Like, what kind of life is that? No one wants that life. Like, I'm going to put down my phone. I'm going to like choose to live a more embodied life where maybe I can feel more fulfilled in not having a million followers on social media, but having 100 people who I influence in my neighborhood, in my school, in my church. Like, I think there's something compelling about that more modest goal in life. Like, very few people are ever going to be famous influencers on social media, even though, like, for a time, I feel like when you asked Gen Z or Gen Alpha, like, what's your desired occupation? Like, what's your dream job? For the last couple of years, I've seen those surveys, and it's always like YouTube influencer is my dream job. And
Hmm.
that's so depressing, right? Because like very few of them will become that. And
Hmm.
it's actually so much more compelling, I think, to do something with your life that's tangible, where you're not creating content for millions of unseen digital consumers, but you're having real influence in lives that you can see and relationships that are, bearing fruit because you know them and you're doing life with them. So, yeah, I'm encouraged by that trend. And I hope that our book is a good resource for helping not only young people make that choice to like be embodied, active participants in life rather than digital spectators, but as we were saying, for also people of all ages, older people. Older folks, I think, need to have permission to be less technologically savvy.
Hmm.
Like, if you know how to use Amazon, that's probably enough. If you can use Amazon to buy things, email, texting, like you're good, right? You can put down your phone and just go garden in your backyard. That's a better use of your time. So,
Yeah. So one of the things you talk about is plausibility structures and how
mhm.
digital media affects the way that we, yeah, interact with things. Could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea of plausibility structures is like you model things that people didn't know were possible, and you create plausibility structures. So actually, I think one of the good things the internet has done is make it easier for people to see things modeled or a type of life lived that maybe they wouldn't have ever seen if their world were reduced only to their analog community. Like, I know I have been benefited by connecting with people, finding people online who are doing things, having ideas that create a plausibility structure. Like, oh, I could do that too. Oh, there's someone else out there who has that thought. So on one hand, I think there's something good that digital technology has done with creating plausibility structures, but there's also the dark side of that, where online you can find plausibility structures for kind of whatever you want to find, right? So if you're in some sort of sinful behavior, or let's talk about like the LGBT issue. If you have gender dysphoria and you're a young person and you're tempted to want your ideology on that issue to be validated, well, there's a lot of space online where you can find that validation and you can see those plausibility structures. And that's true for anything, whatever like crazy ideology that you have, political extremism. There's a corner of the internet where you can find a niche and you can find a tribe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the most damaging things that we're seeing on a societal level, is this hyper fragmentation and partisan division. And I feel like the internet is playing a big role in that, because it's creating plausibility structures in negative ways for every little niche belief or ideology that you might be prone to head in that direction. So in previous eras before the internet, if you like started down a path of like craziness, your local community, your family, your church, your pastor would like intervene and basically prevent you from going too far down that path, because there was no network of validation where you could like keep kind of being affirmed in that choice.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all changed in the internet era, where if maybe your family and your pastor and your local community doesn't agree with the decision you're making and actually is trying to pull you back from the cliff, so to speak, but there's tons of people online who are calling out to you like, no, you're doing a perfectly valid thing. Like, your family just needs to like, maybe you should disown your family, because
Mm-hmm.
actually their disapproval is hateful. It's like actually could lead you to suicide. Like
Mm-hmm.
their disapproval is killing you. Literally, that's what online influencers are saying
Mm-hmm.
on like LGBT issues. And so people are finding a community of affirmation online. And that's happening not only on issues of sex and gender, but on politics and like the manosphere, where like young men who maybe are prone to have bad views of women are finding like Andrew Tate and people like that, where their views are kind of perpetuated and validated. Young women, are similarly on certain issues, are finding communities of affirmation, plausibility structures. So that's a long answer, but I think it's a really big issue. And it's one of the things that can sometimes be good in terms of the internet, but oftentimes is quite bad.
Yeah, and I mean, the difficulty with it, like you mentioned earlier, is people getting drawn into, fake things and stuff that's like
Right.
just totally made up. I know that there was one recently where this like influencer who was like a trad wife influencer
Mm-hmm.
came out to be like, is a total lie. Like, it's years long lie, and she had
Mm-hmm.
influenced all these people. And yeah, how do you differentiate all that stuff? And
Yeah.
so what about this idea though that plausibility structures can erode our ability to believe in transcendent truths? Have you run across anything like that?
What do you mean? Unpack that question a bit more.
Well, this is something that I came up with
Mm,
as thumbing through your book, that
mm,
there are plausibility structures that technology and TV create,
mm,
and our use of our smartphones erodes our ability to believe in transcendence,
mm.
and kind of like our ability to
Yeah.
experience the transcendent, because essentially we're just kind of like numbing
Yeah.
ourselves to death.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the very form of like social media and digital technology, it basically works against truth and transcendence, because it's your any given day online on social media, you come across so many like competing truth claims, right? Like, one person says this is true, the next person on your feed says the exact opposite is true. And everyone is just kind of, it's like a free for all of like claims. We saw this in like COVID, for example, and during the pandemic, like there were like constantly people saying the exact opposite of like what is COVID? What should we think about this? There were people who were saying it's the scariest thing ever. It's the worst thing. We need to like all hunker down for years and not leave the house and have our masks on everywhere. And there were scientists and experts, quote unquote, saying that. But then there were experts and influencers on the exact opposite who are basically saying this is completely overblown. This is nothing more than a cold. Like, we shouldn't be changing our lives and our habits whatsoever, right? So what do you do in a world where there's like that type of expertise on both sides of an issue and they're saying the exact opposite? That happens all day, every day on the internet, whether it's political claims or claims about the economy right now. Like, it's like tariffs. Like, you have people on all sides saying extreme things like this is going to ruin the global economy. It's the apocalypse. Or other people saying like, no, like, calm down. This is like a good thing. So I think the internet works against stable truth in that way. It creates this plausibility structure for epistemological chaos, basically, where all of us end up just throwing up our hands and saying like, we can't land on truth. Like, agreement, consensus on truth is an impossibility in the digital age. That's the impression. That's the plausibility structure that the internet and all of its information chaos creates. And so, and also just the ephemerality of it, the fast moving nature of it. This is something I talk a lot about in my last book, The Wisdom Pyramid, where I talk about like, we have too much information. Our information comes at us too fast, and the information we receive is too algorithmically directed at me as an individual. So it's biased towards my like preferences. So all three of those things render the information less than trustworthy. Like, the glut of information makes it like impossible to sift through to find like what is true here. And the speed of information today makes it impossible to like catch up and fact check and like vet the information sufficiently. And then the algorithmic orientation of information, it makes it such that you can never know whether what you're seeing on social media is tweaked a little bit to fit what the algorithm knows you want to read and click on, versus whether this is like an objective report of something. So for all those reasons, I think truth in a solid kind of sense is basically like a victim of the internet epistemology. And so it's hard to talk about transcendence online and like something that exists that's solid out there, because everything we experience online just basically communicates to us. You can't find truth. It's why post-truth has become this phrase to describe the digital age. Like, we live in a post-truth world. I think that technology has really accelerated that turn of our culture in the post-truth direction.
I want to talk briefly about like what are some steps that people can take if they want to counteract this, like reclaim real life in a digital age. But before I get to that, I do want to ask you this, that a lot of churches use digital platforms for evangelism, for discipleship, for even like promoting and reaching new people. I mean, what do you think it looks like to do that well, without like, of course, just becoming, Luddites?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And that's one thing that I will say about our approach in the book, Scrolling Ourselves to Death, is we're not Luddites. We're not suggesting that like the best thing we can all do is just throw away our smartphones and like never go on the internet and be totally like analog farmers, for the rest of our lives. We're not saying that. So I think there is a way that we can be responsible users of technology as tools that enhance the church, not that don't compromise the church. So that's the distinction I would make. Like, as churches think about how to use digital technology, I think the key question they have to ask is, does this use of digital technology enhance what the church is as an embodied, fundamentally embodied community of believers who are coming together to worship God, but also to edify each other in kind of this horizontal way? not as consumers that are just looking at a screen, for example, and taking content, but as contributors. That's what the church is. It's this body of people God brings together to contribute, right? We're all members of one body, different functions. If technology is changing that, the very nature of the church, then it's a problem and we shouldn't be doing it. But there's lots of uses of digital technology that I think are not doing that and are more innocuous and are just kind of helping, let's say, advertise a church with a website. Like, if you have a nice website where people can kind of learn about your church on the internet, but it's ultimately a catapult to get them there in person, that's great. If you have social media, the same idea. Like, if you're just going to the spaces online where people are to kind of grab them and get them intrigued about your church, that's great. And along those same lines, like, I don't have a problem with churches having like a podcast or having a video ministry, as long as they are not replacing the embodied fellowship. So that's where, like, you don't want people to like listen to the church's podcast as a substitute for like a Sunday morning worship experience. Mm-hmm. You don't want them to like watch videos on YouTube of the pastor preaching a message as a substitute for. I think if they're supplemental things, if there are ways to kind of engage people in discipleship throughout the week and grab people and draw them into in-person experiences, then that's great. So that's what I would say. I think about that question of, is it changing the nature of the church? Bad. Is it supplementing and enhancing the biblical nature of the church? Then that can be a valid and helpful use.
Yeah. Okay, so how about this? Like, what does it look like for the church to intentionally push back against digital disembodiment? What are some steps that churches and families can take to reclaim life in this digital age?
Yeah. One practical step I think would be to think really carefully about, like, should we offer a live stream option for our worship services? Like, that was a necessary thing during the pandemic for a short time. But now that it's not necessary in that way, is it doing more harm than good to give people the option to just like kick it on Sunday mornings on their couch and watch church on a screen? So that's one thing I would say. Like, just think very carefully about that decision. What you really want every member of your church to do is to be there in person for the worship gathering, the fellowship of the saints. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. And just by gathering people together in a physical space in a habitual way, that alone is such a rare thing in the digital age. People don't do that. Like, aside from like your kids going to school in a physical way, on a habitual way, or if you have a job that's not remote and you're going to like a physical office, like, we don't do this anymore as a society. We don't go to like the Kiwanis Club anymore for like in-person fellowship. We don't go to like bowling leagues. There's a whole book, Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which came out like 2 decades ago, which gets at this idea. Like, we are living isolated, individualistic, lonely digital lives for the most part. So I think just by reasserting the beauty of the embodied fellowship and the habitual gathering together of the saints, like, that is a countercultural thing that the church today needs to lean into and celebrate. And to your point about like Gen Z, younger people today are kind of craving that. I think a lot of boomer pastors, Gen X pastors need to kind of be alert to that trend. Like, if you actually want to reach the young people, being tech savvy is not necessarily what you need to do. Like, you need to be more analog. You need to advertise like, this is a church where we want you to come and have a radically different experience than what you experience in digital life. We want you to come here and not have the anxiety that you have when you scroll through Instagram and compare yourself to people. We want you to come here and have an experience that is the opposite of what you experience on TikTok, where your like head is spinning by how chaotic it is. Like, We want you to have a contemplative experience where your attention is not going in a million directions at once, but for a couple hours, at least once a week, your attention is fixed on Jesus together with brothers and sisters who are all looking at that. We're not looking at each other. I mean, we're not looking at ourselves in a mirror, which is what the smartphone essentially is. It's this narcissistic mirror that we're constantly looking at. We're not comparing ourselves as we do on social media. We're looking at Jesus. And I feel like that simple truth of what the church is, this like experience of attentive fidelity to Christ in a world where our attention is just so preoccupied with content and screens and TikTok, junk food. The nourishment of like attentive fidelity to Christ in a church is that's the transcendence that we're looking for. That's the beauty. And I think so for churches, you don't have to get creative about this. Like just double down on what the church is, like the fundamentals of what a church is. That's what's going to stand out in the digital age. And ultimately, I think that's what's going to be a haven and a refuge for people in the scrolling age.
Yeah, just two thoughts real quick. One is that as a pastor, like I meet people all the time who come to our church and they'll tell me, I've been watching you online for weeks. And it almost seems like the video thing and the live stream is not just like serving our people, but it's become the new front door. Used to be that your website was the front door. Now it's your live stream and being able to watch that after the fact. I think that like, I don't know. I almost meet nobody who hasn't watched our services online. And I don't know if that's good or bad. I tend to think that it's good. Like people can kind of like, I think there's way more anxiety than there used to be over embodied experiences. And so now it's like people get nervous about going places and doing things in person and like presenting, if you will.
Yes.
And so that kind of reduces some of that anxiety. But of course that wouldn't exist if we didn't live in the age which we live in, but we do live in the age that we live in. The other part of it is that, so I had an injury about 2 years ago, just kind of very bad snowboarding injury. And so I was laid up for like 6 weeks. I had multiple surgeries, but I just remember getting towards the end of it and just, I loved that I could like stay connected and watch church on Sunday. But there's just something, and I don't know if I have the right words for it. It's almost like absolutely crushing or like soul sucking of pushing the power button at the end of the church service. And then you're still alone in your living room.
Right.
There's something like, this seems like not right about the whole thing.
Absolutely. And I think we all felt that during the pandemic, when we were like doing this kind of digital video church substitute, like it just was not equal substitute. You felt the lack very severely. And one of the chapters in the book is written by Jay Kim, who's a pastor in San Francisco area. And it's all about the beauty of the importance of embodied church fellowship. But he tells the story of his church and the first in-person gathering they had after the like long pandemic restrictions were lifted. In California, they were very, very long. And it's just the way he describes it is getting at what you're saying. Like when people showed up on that first Sunday of physical meeting together, like there was just this collective sense of like, oh, this is what I've been missing. This is what I've wanted. This is right. It was not right to do what we were doing. So yes, I think there can be good uses of like video church for like people who are injured, people who are shut-ins, elderly. And so it's worth having the conversation as a church for sure. Like, are those positive benefits worth, the potential problems that we might have with this, of the option being abused by people who can come, physically, and they're just choosing to watch it virtually. So yeah, I mean, our church has the same. Like there was a lady in our church a couple of weeks ago who I met, and she had watched our church, like the video sermons, for like weeks before she like darkened the door of the church in a physical sense for the first time. And so as that that new front door to the church, yeah, I think there's merit to thinking about that. But I would just advise pastors and church leaders to just have that conversation of the costs and the benefits. I think with any technology, we should be having that conversation. And that's kind of ultimately, I would say, the big takeaway of our book, Scrolling Ourselves to Death, practically, is that we want Christians to just think more critically about any technology. We can't just rush to adopt it in a utilitarian way. Hey, AI is this cool new technology. How can we deploy that in ministry? Our instinct should not be instant adoption of technologies, nor should it be instant rejection out of fear. It just needs to be careful consideration and thorough conversation about what are the potential downsides of using this? What are the potential benefits? How can we be wise about proceeding with any given technology? I would say that's, in a nutshell, what we're trying to compel Christians to do when it comes to technology.
What would you say to the guy at the gym who's going to church online with some guy in Texas that I've never heard of?
So they're not in Texas, and they're going
Correct.
to a church online
we're not
in Texas.
in Texas.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that is not what the church is meant to be. The church is meant to be this local expression of God's people in a particular physical place. We're all connected to the church in a capital C sense globally, because we're all part of the people of God. But from the beginning of, in the New Testament church, as the apostles were starting to plant churches and Paul was doing his ministry, it was all about local fellowships in particular places. And each of those communities has their own flavors and their own challenges and their own issues. But that is what the church is. It is a local, physical, embodied fellowship where you're coming together to do physical things, right? One point that I always bring up in this conversation is the Lord's Supper. That is an institution. That is a mark of a church. It always has been. Every Christian church throughout Christian history has instituted the Lord's Supper. It's a non-negotiable part of a local church. How do you do that virtually? If you're going to church, if you're going to a Texas-based church virtually, you can't do that. So that alone takes away the plausibility of what you are calling church actually being church. Same thing with baptism. That's also something churches have done throughout Christian history. You can't do a baptism virtually. You can't take your digital avatar and do a virtual baptism. I'm sure people have tried that somewhere, but that's not a real baptism. There's something about being in a physical space where you can find a trough of water or a pool or whatever you're doing it in and dunk people in the water, if that's the type of baptism you believe in. I know there's differences of opinion there, but in every sense, baptism, communion, the Lord's Supper are physical actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even singing, that's also something that has been around church history since the beginning. It's hard to replicate singing virtually. You can watch a worship band on a screen singing for you, but that's more like a concert than corporate worship. There's something important about being in the presence of the saints, hearing other people's voices saying. There's something beautiful about that you can't replicate virtually. So those are a few things I would say to the guy in the gym.
Cool. All right. Final word. What would you say to kind of wrap this up? What's the good thing about this book, and what would your message be for the church in our moment?
I mean, I think it would be kind of what I said earlier about we just need to think more carefully about technology because the stakes are high. We're starting to see culturally, even outside of Christianity, secular experts are starting to write books about all of the ill effects of social media and digital technology. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, for example, you're starting to see states and countries like institute laws of like age-based restrictions for social media apps. So there's an emerging consensus that like these technologies are having really bad emotional effects, and we need to think more carefully about how we're using these technologies. Well, for Christians, we have an added layer of like, not only are these technologies having bad emotional effects, but they're having bad spiritual effects. We are scrolling ourselves to death spiritually, because so much of spiritual vitality has to do with having space to give our attention to God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we live in this social media age where attention is the currency. We live in an attention economy, and every Silicon Valley company is like spending a ton of money trying to grab our attention because there's money in our attention. And that's why people are addicted to TikTok. That's why people can't put down their phones when they're like waiting for 5 minutes for coffee at Starbucks or sitting at a bus stop and they have 2 minutes of downtime. What does everyone do in those moments? Every single one of us now pulls out our phone and scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the companies that are invested in getting our attention are succeeding in that. They've figured out how to get us hooked into this constant mediation on our phones. But the spiritual cost of that is very great, because it means when you fill every spare moment of your day with screens and scrolling, when are you going to have time to be still and to be present with the Lord and to pray to him, for example, or to like be in his word, or just to kind of be still in your soul and contemplate, or to look at the birds and look at the tree, my avocado tree that I'm looking at in my backyard, and just contemplate like how God is speaking to us in nature. How does he speak to us in the still small voice, in the quiet spaces of our life? And in the scrolling world, there's just ever fewer quiet spaces where we can be alert and attentive to those things. And that, I think, is a huge spiritual question for the digital age. Where are our moments of attentive fidelity to God? So and that's one of the big things that we're trying to get at in scrolling ourselves to death, is our spiritual death is the thing that we need to figure out how to avoid.
Well, I'm glad that you're asking those questions. I'm glad that you're putting this together. So people can find the book wherever books are sold, and there will be links to it in the show notes. Brett, thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Theology for the People. New episodes are being released on Mondays this season, so make sure you're subscribed to the podcast on whatever platform you use, and that way you'll be notified when new episodes are released. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to check out our YouTube channel and our TikTok channel, both of which recently came about. I would love it if you would share this episode with somebody you know who might benefit from it. That way this podcast can grow and more people can encounter these conversations and these theological concepts, which will enrich and hopefully drive them towards Jesus. Until next time, thanks for listening, and God bless you.